has been a point of discussion since the start of World of Warcraft. Blizzard is biased for one faction at the expense of the other. Now, with the fact that the Alliance sacked Orgrimmar twice, essentially, the fact that they won the battle for Azeroth and pretty much all the battles in the war, the fact that they're essentially always the good guys, could there actually be some truth to this statement? On the other hand, they lost a lot of battles, they lost Terramore and Teldrassil, and let's be real, a lot more people are actually playing the Horde as opposed to the Alliance in the actual game. However, is there any truth to this statement, as Blizzard actually at some points even admitted that certain expansions have been alliance biased slightly? So what are the arguments for and against this statement being true? Did you know if you use pirated software like Windows, you're very vulnerable to viruses and malicious activity? Well, the sponsor of this video, Royal City Keys, is offering licensed software for the cheapest prices on the market. In fact, I got Windows 11 for about €3 in total. Now, if you use my code DORAN, you will get an additional 10% off, so if you want to support the channel and get something for yourself, check out my link in the description or the QR code on the screen. So, let's be real, people have been complaining since forever, and a lot of that has never actually been based on anything. Whenever something is done, someone is going to say they're biased one way or the other. However, there are actually some points that make sense when you examine it, and some areas where people may actually be right. They may actually have a point. Right off the bat, let's be real, gameplay-wise, Blizzard is definitely not Alliance biased. In fact, I've already made a video, but on some servers there is like 85 to 15% Horde Alliance ratios, and on average a lot more people are playing Horde as opposed to the Alliance. Not even that, all the competitive metrics leans towards the Horde, and at the moment the Horde really is the winning faction. However, there are some points that are definitely true where the Alliance really is heavily favored in regards to the actual story and the lore side of the game. At this point in the franchise, there are no good guys, the good and the evil faction. However, Warcraft as a series really started completely different with this black and white, really black and white contrast, as the Horde initially was literally the epitome of evil, just bad guy orcs invading the peaceful human kingdoms of Azeroth for the sake of conquest. They brought destruction, ogres, dragons, trolls down upon the human paladins that only wanted to defend their homeland. However, over the years that really changed and a lot of races joined the factions really evolved. In fact, orcs and the humans are really not that big of a deal, as now we have so many different peoples that are a part of the Horde and the Alliance. Then it was further and further expanded that the orcs were just manipulated by the Legion, so ultimately they were a victim themselves. What is interesting though, despite this massive evolution and the fact that Warcraft lore made like a 180-degree turn since Warcraft 1, I think Blizzard still sort of kept that original concept. Sure, it isn't nearly as black and white as it once was, it is a bit diluted, a lot diluted, but it's still kind of there in the back. I mean, let's just examine the previous expansions. We've had the madman Garrosh that wanted to absorb all god power, that only cared about orcish supremacy and wanted to rule the world for the sake of his own power and an ego trip. Then we've had another warchief, Sylvanas, that was serving some obscure death god in the Shadowlands that literally just used the faction in order to create conflict, and she did a lot of terrible things. The only bright point there is Vol'jin, the very short time he ruled, and he pretty much did exactly nothing and ultimately got tricked by Muizala in order to allow Sylvanas to serve her own goals. So really, he was just a tool, a very short-lived tool. Now, when you examine what happened on the other side, Alliance has pretty much just been the valiant defenders, and they had consistent leadership that was generally noble and generally ethical for the most part. Sure, there was a tad bit of instability back in Classic when Varian was missing, but they were ruled by Bolvar, who was beyond an ethical and noble paladin. Then Varian was sort of hot-headed. He had this side, this emotional side, made some rash decisions, but he was almost always noble and never really did any really bad things. Then the leader of the Alliance gave his life against the Legion invasion, proving that he was even more noble, and then he was succeeded by his ever-noble, perfect Light Priest son that was too good for his own good, and he was all about peace at any cost. So throughout the entire storyline, the Alliance had the good and the noble leaders, while the Horde was going from one crazy power-hungry warchief to another, despite the fact that this was not an orcish demonic horde anymore, but it had races like the Peaceful Tauren. Now, that is comes from the side of the leadership. The other side are the actual battles and the zones. Realistically, there are a lot of contested areas in the actual game, but territory-wise, there is a slight bias towards the Alliance having more zones. Blizzard tried to balance this out a bit in BFA, but then ultimately they kinda reverted most of it. However, the main point are the actual battles and the wars that occurred and just the way they are framed. I previously made videos listing both the Alliance and the Horde crimes, and let's be real, the Horde is way worse in terms of atrocities and crimes committed. Sure, the Alliance hasn't been innocent either, but most of the time they either cared a bit for the casualties and had some humanitarian efforts, or it was done by someone loosely related to the Alliance, if not related at all, like Gyarados, or the Interminate Camps that was ultimately not even the same Alliance, while Horde at the same time was like, let's do crime and we're going to support it directly, we're not even gonna cover our tracks. Then when it comes to battles, most of the time the Alliance was on the defense while the Horde is on the offense. Sure, there were some scenarios with both factions were attacking, such as Mists of Pandaria. Here, both factions reach for the newly discovered continent, but when you think about it, the Alliance was more like, let's follow the Horde and let's not stay behind, while the Horde was like, let's get to the heart of the ancient forgotten old gods so we can eat it and so we can conquer the world. Then the Horde descended into a civil war, and the Alliance, as the good guy, decided to help one of the warring factions. They essentially sacked Orgrimmar, got to the throne room, but instead of conquering it and imposing their own will and doing something sort of evil, they decided to be the good guy and to give them a warning slap, once again being the noble faction taking the high road. Then, with Battle for Azeroth, the Horde clearly started this war. The Alliance was the obvious victim. Then they had their own little terrible offensive on Lordran, but once again, the Horde is the bad guy as they did more damage to their own city than the Alliance invasion itself. Then, when we look at the entire war overall, the Alliance not only won the war, but they pretty much won all the important battles. They restored the Night Elven lands, they defended their own, and ultimately, Undercity was just clans but was terribly damaged. So, the point I'm making, despite whatever faction you're playing, I think you can kinda agree with me here that there is definitely a bit of bias with the Horde being the constant aggressor and the bad guy, while the Alliance is mostly on the defensive and is nobler in general. There are barely any Alliance bad guys overall, but you have Garrosh, Sylvanas, you have the Horde inciting Radgate, and a bunch of other events. Now, at one point, Blizzard actually sort of admitted there is a bit of Alliance bias in Cataclysm, and I don't think that is that bad of a thing. It is kinda natural. It isn't easy to just balance out the factions perfectly so it can be like 50-50. However, let us now take the other perspective and see where the Alliance isn't actually all that biased, and there are some decent points for this. I'd say especially lately, similar to how the light is grayer than it used to be, the Alliance has also been made a bit more gray. First, there is like 3 half-row commanders that they have, Gen, Tyrande, and Jaina, and they're acting a lot on their emotions and starting conflicts as vengeance, not really taking the high road as is usual for the Alliance. Someone here could make the counterpoint that this is actually the perfect example of Alliance bias, as all these 3 are actually acting out on the fact that the Horde hurt them first, but let's just focus on the point at hand. Gen literally started a faction conflict based on no evidence back in Legion when he thought Sylvanas abandoned them to the Legion invasion. Jaina literally wanted to drown the entire city of Orgrimmar full of civilians, and she also just started destroying and demolishing the Blood Elves in Dalaran, and Tyrande went a bit crazy with the Night Warrior, but she didn't really do all that much. At the same time, there is the argument that the current leader, Tyrellian, is not all that great and is more dedicated to the Army of the Light in the Alliance, and he actually participated in some torture. Then, you could make the argument while they won the Battle for Azeroth, the War of Thorns, they didn't really win anything. Teldrassil still lost, they lost a lot of their numbers, and they never really retook Lordaeron. At the same time, previously Terramore was mana bombed and it was never really restored. It is a ruin to this day. So, with all these arguments, you can't really say that they have always been favored. I mean, some of the races like the Night Elves have really received and continue to receive the short end of the stick. However, the argument isn't that much in them winning wars being the dominant faction, but it is the fact that there is a bit of a bias in the Alliance overall being the good guys. Objectively, the Alliance never really had death camps and experimented on live beings like the Horde did, nor did they create this terrible plague, nor did they burn down an entire city full of civilians. They did some bad things, but most of the time it is justified. So ultimately, my opinion on this is I think the faction bias is definitely highly exaggerated by a lot of the community, but there is slight truth to this. There is definitely a bit of bias. The Alliance really has been the good guys and the defenders for the most part, and almost always taking the high road, which I think ultimately derives from the actual root of the entire Warcraft franchise. Thank you for watching. Check out how will Orc Paladins be explained by clicking on the screen, and check out Lawrence Academy for videos on real world history. See you next time.